Dick is the author of multiple best-selling books. He's author of over a dozen, I think 13, working on his 14th book, including works on the assassination of John F. Kennedy, ranging all the way to the biography of James Hillman. And he's currently working on the second volume of James Hillman's biography. So if we're lucky, maybe we'll get to hear some of what's coming. And with that, we'll turn it over. What I do want to tell you is, as you know, some days we go slowly through presentation and ask questions as we go, and sometimes the guest will give us an introduction and then we'll talk. This is going to be the introduction, then talk version. Cool. Welcome.
All right. Thank you. And thank you, Dana, for having me, and great to see all of you here. I've never done this particular presentation before, so it's not typical. I've lectured on James Hillman, the Jung Institute and other places, and but this is a personal story, and it's a story of more about how my relationship with James Hillman and how he mentored me in a way and also pushed me in directions that I think I never would have gone in my life if I had never met him. So I feel like it was a fated, remarkable thing that happened to me. I was deeply privileged to have known him and work with him on the biography. The last thing I actually would have expected. I am not a psychologist. I am not an expert in psychology, but I knew a lot about it, and certainly about Jung and Hillman. And but anyway, tonight I'm going to be reading a little bit from two books. Not so much this one. This was volume 1, and more. And he's in this one too. And this is a book I wrote about my son and myself, and it's called "My Mysterious Son: A Life-Changing Passage Between Schizophrenia and Shamanism." And so that's James Hillman as I knew him. And when I met him in 1999, my then 20-year-old son, Franklin, was still going in and out of hospitals after having been diagnosed with schizophrenia a few years before. And my relationship with James Hillman began by accident, really, through a mutual friend who sold him and myself and my friends, my wife, organic vegetables in a market in Connecticut. And a young fellow, we were talking one day in our kitchen, and he said, "Oh, my dad sells James Hillman his vegetables." And so I called my old friend Wayne, who's an organic farmer, and I said, "So, Wayne, you know James Hillman?" Because we'd been reading him for a few years and really fascinated by his work. And I said, "Could you possibly introduce me?" And Wayne said, "Well, I don't know. He's a very private person, you know." And so I sent James Hillman a copy of my second book, which was called Black Genius and the American Experience. And he liked it. And so we ended up having a lunch together. And during that lunch, we found that we had quite a few things in common, including one of which was that we both had been traveling in Africa, over large parts of Africa, when we were very young. I was in my 20s, he was in his 20s, and there's James Hillman in East Africa in 1950 with 2 white rhinos. This picture is not in my book. I just happened to find it today. This was a ranch that a game catcher named Carr Hartley had. And I'm just going to read you a little bit from Volume 1 about Hillman and Africa, and Jung and Africa also. Puer is the Latin term for young man, and Hillman would devote an entire book to the subject, the Puer Papers. As Blake Burleson writes in his 2005 book, Jung and Africa, the African landscape is littered with puer aeterni, eternal youth, who met untimely deaths. From the plane crashes of the writer Antoine de Saint-Exupéry and Dennis Finch Hatton, to the fulfilled death wishes of Hemingway and Speke, to the martyrdom of Livingstone, Africa provided the Netherlands where the shadow side of men could find expression. Jung himself wondered whether he would return from his sojourn there, and after his traveling companion George Beckwith had a premonition that Jung would die from a snake bite, Beckwith always walked ahead of him with a gun and ended up killing 13 deadly mambas.
Wow.
One friend who knew Hillman over time described him as a puer aeternus, and certainly in Africa he possessed that sensibility. It was not tourism or safariism. He was simply there, with no long-range ambitions, no planned article for a magazine like National Geographic, no journal keeping, and taking very few pictures before his camera got stolen. I was not living a movie in my mind, watching myself do these things, he reflected later. No thoughts of how great it was to be in Africa or anything like that. Then what was the driving force? It's a quest, but you don't know what the goal is, and you have to be up to it. I feel that the test is more important than the quest. It's being called to meet a challenge, an initiation, which at least at that age is very important and what calls a lot of young guys into the military. Asked whether he'd felt protected in some ways, Hillman responded, yeah, I felt I was the explorer, the adventurer, Richard Halliburton, who he knew as a boy in Atlantic City. I didn't even feel I needed to protect Kate, his then girlfriend, later his wife, I don't think. Jung, who was twice Hillman's age when he traveled to Africa, seeing a warrior standing on a rock, quote, had the feeling that I'd already experienced this moment and had always known this world, as if I were this moment returning to the land of my youth, and as if I knew that dark-skinned man who'd been waiting for me for 5,000 years. In Jung's view, as Lawrence Vanderpost wrote, Africa attracted Europeans because it provoked through its own physical character and example what was forgotten and first and primitive in themselves. Hillman's approach to Africa was apparently less psychological, but his experiences amid the various cultures prefigured pivotal events in his life and writing. 35 years later, he would become a leader at a series of men's group retreats, some lasting as long as a week in the woods of Minnesota, West Virginia, California, and elsewhere. Malidoma Some, an initiate of the Dagara tribe in West Africa, was another of the regular participants at these gatherings, and he reflected in 2008. I had an experience first of James Hillman being an intellectual titan. He knew how to introduce a subject matter, how to develop it, and how to close it. He was so tight and his mind was so complex, like a fortress. And really, I was afraid of that fortress. Then, with a group in North Carolina, I introduced for the first time a radical ritual, in this case, a water ritual. That was when I noticed James Hillman's genuine interest in ritual, and the demonstration that he actually knows something about it. In the middle of the week, he called me to his side in the bush, asked me to take a piece of leaf and put it in the water and brush his body with it, which is something we know in my culture as a cleansing. So for me, to see that fortress of a mind become ritualistically alert and trusting an African guy to help him with some kind of energy that he needed to be cleansed from, that really got my respect. While Jung had been profoundly moved by the vast herds of wild animals grazing in soundless stillness as they had done from time immemorial, for Hillman it was more the strength of in this indigenous world, the indigenous culture, the indigenous vitality, the self-sufficiency of these people, the life of people who are pagan. So after that first meeting, there was a second, and we met Margot McLean, an artist who had by that time become James Hillman's third wife. And they became acquainted with others, and I live in a big extended family, and the Hillmans James and Margot began visiting us in our various homes, and we became friends. I certainly had no intention of being his biographer. I was working on other projects. At one point, I was doing books with I was sort of not a ghostwriter because my names were on them, but I was doing books with Jesse Ventura, the wrestler turned governor of Minnesota, and which was nice because they all became pretty big sellers. And then I was writing about James Hillman on the other hand, so that's kind of a weird combination, but it seemed to work. And but we became friends, and early in 2004, his sister was there visiting in Connecticut, and I was there, my wife and I, and she was a great storyteller. And I said to James afterwards, I said, you really should get some of her stories on tape while she's still living, and because she's older than he was. So this gave them the idea to have a family reunion and bring together that summer and have it filmed. And I knew a young filmmaker who did it. All of he had 3 siblings, and all of his kids, he had 4 children, and 3 of them came. And they would just talk about the early years and growing up in Atlantic City, and it would be filmed and like a record for the family. And since I was a reporter, I've been an investigative journalist for most of my years, a lot of it on the environment, I asked a lot of the questions. And then afterwards, our wives, Margot and Alice, sat down and started talking about, well, they had a couple glasses of wine, was he ever going to do a biography? And he never wanted to do that. He felt like everything was in his work, and that's the way he wanted it. But then they came to a conclusion that, yeah, maybe he should, and maybe I could do it. So that's how it happened. And we ended up traveling. He said, we talked on the phone. He said, this is not going to be a quick book. This will take years, Well, it has taken years. Volume 1 came out in 2012, and Volume 2 I'm still working on, about halfway through it, but I'll get there, I think, in the relatively near future. And it's a labor of love, really, and now about his legacy since he passed in 2011. But we traveled together to Ireland, where he went to college, to Switzerland, where he was the director of studies at the Jung Institute after studying when Jung was still alive in the 1950s. And then I interviewed dozens of people, and he participated in the biography. He would, I'd write a chapter, and then I would give it to him to critique, and not just critique really, but to add to. He didn't try to censor me. He didn't say, you leave this out or leave that out. He would really leave it to me to write it, but he always had things to add to the chapters, and of course that was amazing. Just a great privilege to be able to work with anybody like that, but especially him. And then decided toward the end of his life that I would need to do 2 volumes, and I wanted to finish Volume 1 while he was still living, and it didn't come out while he was still alive, but he was able to, see it through pretty much to the conclusion. And you may have seen it, I don't know, but the cover shows him as a boy, and I have copies of these afterwards if any of you are interested in getting one from me. But he was a boy on the beach of Atlantic City, which is where he grew up, and there he is as a little kid in Atlantic City, in nature, which he loved very much. And then I'm going to cut to a picture of my son as a boy. He's biracial. He grew up part of the time on a farm that we had, a family farm in Kansas. And so that's Franklin, is his name, when he was young. That's Hillman when he graduated. That's his graduation picture from Trinity College in Dublin. And that's my son graduating from Beacon High School in the Boston area. Now, he was suffering from mental illness at that time. He graduated from a high school that had a lot of kids with that problem. It happened out of the blue, as it happens to a lot of people. When Franklin was 17, he suddenly came back from a great summer in Mexico and said, Dad, I can't find my old self again. And then suddenly he was suicidal. And we had no idea, his mother and I and the friends that we lived with, what was going on. And I know thousands of parents have gone through this. And he had to be hospitalized. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. And there were a series of a long time, many, many years when, we didn't know what else to do except follow the doctor's prescriptions at that point. I mean, so he was on several different meds at one time, and at one point put on, a tremendous amount of weight, and it was really, really tough, really a tough period of years, which has an interesting, not ending because he's still alive and he's doing very well, but which we'll get to in the course of this. But he was living in a group home, and he was having delusions that I didn't know how to cope with. I mean, we'd be going somewhere and he'd just say these outrageous things out of the blue, or at least outrageous to me, and I didn't know how to handle it, and I would just it was very off-putting to me, and I would just I didn't know what to do, but James tuned into this, and at the same time I was going to interview him quite regularly in Connecticut, and so I'm going to share with you a section, just a couple pages in the book, My Mysterious Son, of how James Hillman really changed my entire attitude toward my son. And I'm grateful. I'll be eternally grateful for that. So by the end of September 2004, Franklin's back in the group home, but the repetitive cycle is taking its toll on me. On a trip to interview Hillman for the biography, I decide to raise the big question with which I've been wrestling. This concerns my son's delusions, which persist despite taking his medications. I explain that one fantasy is that I'm not his father, even though Frank concedes sometimes that I did raise him. He clearly does not want to be who he is. He takes on substitute identities as the reincarnation of Tutankhamun or Bruce Lee. So what do I do in the face of this? Do I accept the delusions? Do I challenge them over time? Or do I simply listen and try to figure out what my son might really be expressing underneath? My tape recorder is running as Hillman responds. You listed the choices already. I am your father is one way to do it. Another way is you enter the delusion with him. The main aim is to maintain a conversation, I would think, to keep connected with him. He's testing you. I don't mean in an oppositional way, but just unconditional acceptance of whatever, because you really can't change anything. The tendency is to treat everything as if it's acute, but you need to accept the fact that a chronic condition is different. You have to realize that it's Chronos, the god of time. You don't look for improvement. It's really walking along with. It's accompanying, without any end in sight, accepting what is and just going along, and talking with him. Also, about things you want to talk to him about. This is a very important part about what you've been doing or thinking. Maybe he doesn't want to hear it, but that doesn't matter. The point is that you're not there out of guilt and fatherhood and all of that, but you're talking to him as a human being. Your normalcy is helpful, because nobody he talks to is normal. They all talk to him about being a sick person. I interject that I'd like to be able to tell my son, when you took this particular medication, you were able to go to school, or maybe we'd write a book together someday, but we can't do it if you're delusional. But then Franklin immediately starts arguing with me. Hillman continues, well, again, you probably have to reconstellate the relationship, not in terms of where you're trying to help him and not trying to get anywhere with him. Simply, you know where I was today? I went to Connecticut. You let go of his being a sick man. Then you may find he tells you things that he doesn't talk about otherwise. You don't know what's going to come out, but it's almost as if you've abandoned being the responsible father, because you can't move him. Okay, that's over with. Make him feel that you really want to see him and tell him things. You say, this guy drove by and I thought, I wish Frank had seen that car. What do you think of that kind of car? He might go into a delusion about the car, but it doesn't matter. You've approached him differently from the therapeutic. I interject again, and differently from my expectations of Franklin. Exactly. It's something that's not your world and not his world, like in the sense of writing a book together, or his world without his medicines, his hospitals, and all that shit. It becomes like sitting in a bar together side by side, talking about the day. Yes, I reply. He says he'd like to write his book, not with me. Exactly. This whole thing with the therapy, he's been inoculated. He doesn't want that. It drives you crazy. That's the last person I would want to see. I used to ask people, what does going crazy mean to you? Does it mean you're going to lay around with your clothes off or shoot somebody? The other question is, where do you want to be? On an island with no phone, curled up in a room in the dark? Who do you want to talk to? People don't want to see therapists. They